In November of 2004, 52-year-old Peter Porco and his wife, 54-year-old Joan Porco, lived in Del Mar, New York in a comfortable two-story home, and they worked for a living. They had been married for over 30 years and they had 2 sons. Christopher was a 21-year-old student at the University of Rochester, and his brother, Jonathan, was a 23-year-old naval officer. On Monday, November 15th, 2004, Peter woke up to start his typical Monday morning work routine. When he didn't get to work that Monday morning, they dispatched a court officer to go make sure he was okay. And so the officer arrives at his house, he knocks on the door, nobody answers, and so he opens the door, and the door hits something on the ground. And there on the ground is Peter Porco's body. He's clearly deceased, and he clearly has a massive head wound. Local police show up, they go upstairs, and they find his wife, Joan, in bed, also with a massive head wound, but she was still alive. They quickly discovered that the home's alarm system had been smashed, and a phone line had been cut from the outside. They discovered a fireman's axe that belonged to the Porcos, hidden inside of one of the bedroom closets. The Porco sons had been away during this attack. John was on his submarine in Connecticut, and Chris was at the University of Rochester. And in fact, Chris found out about the attack on his parents when he saw a news report. And so Chris called the police. Here's the recording.
Hi, my name is Chris Porco. I was just called by the Times-Union saying that my parents were found dead this afternoon. I was wondering if you had any information on me.
As you can tell, Chris is extremely emotional. No, actually, he sounds as calm as if he's ordering a pizza, because Chris Porco was actually a psychopath, and he was the one who attacked his parents with the axe. Chris was failing at school and taking out huge loans in his father's name by forging his signature, and his father found out about it. So Mr. and Mrs. Porco write their son a strongly worded email where they tell him this behavior has to stop, but they love him and they will help him get back on his feet. Chris responded by driving home in the middle of the night, sneaking into his house, and attacking his parents with an axe. After being struck 16 times in the head, Peter suddenly sat up and began his morning routine. When he was finally ready to go, he headed for the door, and then he collapsed and he died. Due to the severity of Peter's head wound, his brain was basically broken and it was unable to recognize he had been gravely injured. So in his final moments, he believed it was just a typical Monday morning going about his work routine, when in reality, he was basically dead after the 16th blow to his head. Joan Porco, she did survive the attack, and after she came out of that medically induced coma, she said she forgot all the details of the attack, even though when she was discovered, she did indicate that Chris, her son, was the attacker. Nonetheless, she got together $250,000 to post Chris's bail, and the two attended the trial together. Chris was very quickly found guilty of killing his father and attempting to kill his mother, and he was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. In the spring of 2003, a highly skilled mountaineer set off for a one-day hike in a Utah canyon. He didn't tell anybody where he was going. As he was descending a narrow portion of the canyon, a boulder came dislodged and landed on his right arm and hand, pinning him there. Initially, he tried everything he could to get his hand free, but he couldn't do it. He even considered amputating, but his knife couldn't cut through the bone. After 5 days, he was out of water and he knew that he was about to die. So he took out his camera and recorded goodbyes to his family before falling asleep, believing he would never wake up again. When he woke up the next morning and hadn't died, he suddenly felt totally motivated to live. And so he did the unthinkable. He managed to break his arm using torque and then cut through the break in his arm with his dull pocket knife. It took him almost 2 hours to do this. After the amputation, he was able to rappel down and get the help that he needed. Aaron Ralston is quoted as saying, "I did not lose my arm, I gained back my life." On August 18th, 2010, Ben McDaniel, who was 30 years old, walked to the end of the pier, put on all of his diving equipment, and jumped in the water. He slowly descended 115 feet and came to a stop right in front of a very famous underwater sign. The sign very clearly tells anybody who sees it, do not go any farther unless you are absolutely certain this is the right thing for you to be doing. If you go farther, you're probably going to die, like the 300 other people that have died doing this particular activity. He swam right past that sign and went 300 feet to the very famous underwater locked gate. Now, the only people that have keys to this are extremely experienced divers, and even they don't typically go into this area because it's so dangerous. Ben was not one of the very experienced divers that was given a key, but he still desperately wanted to get to the other side of the gate. So he's sitting there yanking on the gate, and he's getting himself kind of pushed inside halfway through the gate, and he can't quite get it open. And another diver saw him doing this and was actually concerned that Ben was going to get trapped on the gate itself and would just drown on the gate. And so this diver comes over and uses his key, and maybe against his better judgment opened it, thinking that that was better than him getting stuck on the gate. Ben turns to look at him, gives him a nod, thank you, and he, on his own, swims into one of, if not the single most dangerous underwater caves in the whole world. It's called Vortex Spring Cave. From the locked gate, this cave extends another 1,600 feet and goes down to a depth of 310 feet. The majority of this section of the cave is mapped, but there are sections that are not fully explored because they're so narrow where you have to literally take off your gear, wriggle through a hole, pull your gear through and put it back on. All the while you're barely holding onto your mouthpiece. And so really the full extent of this section of the cave is not known. While we don't know exactly what Ben did when he went through that gate and entered into this extremely dangerous cave, we do know that he didn't come out again. And after a couple of days and no one had seen him, they launched this massive search for him, and they combed as much as they could of inside of that cave, but there were sections that they were just not prepared to go search. And so he was never recovered. All they ever found were 2 of Ben's dive bottles. At 7 p.m. on October 21st, 1978, a 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Valentik flew his small plane over a body of water just south of Australia called the Bass Strait. He'd just taken off from Melbourne, Australia, and his flight plan was to go 60 miles south to an island called King Island, because this represented the first time he'd actually be flying by himself at night. Only a few minutes into this flight, at 7:06 p.m., something strange happened. He suddenly became aware of a light coming from somewhere behind him. Remember, it's nighttime, so it's totally dark where he is, and so the only explanation was either that pilot was off course or Frederick was off course. So he grabs the radio and he gets a hold of Melbourne Air Traffic Control and he says, hey, there's this plane that is like right behind me. They're gaining on me. I'm worried they're going to crash into me. Do I need to deviate? Like, what's going on here? And they tell Frederick, there is no other aircraft anywhere near you. The light, the aircraft that was right behind him, has gotten right behind his. But at that very moment, it becomes very clear to Frederick that this is not some ordinary aircraft. This light suddenly began orbiting Frederick's aircraft. And at the same time, Frederick begins to hear the sound of his engine starting to fail. And so all Frederick could do is just grab the radio and begin talking to air traffic control about what he was seeing. The person Frederick actually spoke to on the ground in this moment was an air traffic controller in Melbourne named Steve Roby. Frederick clearly began talking about some sort of craft orbiting his own and that his engine was starting to fail and he couldn't make an emergency landing. He was over water. And then suddenly Steve remembers hearing this grinding metallic sound come over the radio that basically washed out whatever Frederick was saying, and then it just goes deadly silent. And after that, Frederick disappeared. They never found his plane. There was no sign of a crash. He never landed at King Island or went back to Melbourne. Recently, that audio recording was made public. Here's the official explanation for what happened to Frederick. As he was flying over the Bass Strait, he flipped his plane upside down without realizing it, and the light that he was seeing was actually just a reflection off the water below of his own plane. And eventually, from flying upside down, his engine began to fail and he crashed into the Bass Strait. However, not everybody believes this explanation. Over the years leading up to this incident with Frederick, there had been so many reports of UFOs flying over the Bass Strait and also unexplained disappearances that they've dubbed the Bass Strait Triangle. Frederick's disappearance remains a mystery. All we have is his final call for help.
Delta Sierra Juliet, what type of aircraft is it?
In the early morning hours of March 11th, 1989, 4 young men, they arrived in the beautiful resort town of South Padre Island, which is just off the coast of southern Texas. They were there to enjoy their spring break, and they decided they would go into Mexico and party there. And they drove an hour southwest to Brownsville, Texas, which is a town that sits right on the border of Mexico, and then walked right over the footbridge that crossed the Rio Grande River. They found themselves in the town of Matamoros, and then they made their way into the bars and the clubs. They got tired and left the bar scene. They decided they had so much fun in Matamoros the night before that they had to go back. And then all night they partied and danced and had a great time. It was so crowded in Matamoros, and so the foursome split into two separate pairs. And the lead pair, they made their way ahead and they stopped at the gift shop going back to the US side. The trail pair, which consisted of Mark Kilroy and Bill Huddleston, they got sidetracked when Mark saw a girl, and while Mark is talking to her, Bill goes down an alleyway to urinate. And then when he comes back out, Mark and this girl are not there. Bill makes his way up to the bridge and he meets up with the other two friends. They eventually convince themselves that he must have just left with this girl. They get to their hotel room and Mark's not there. But the next morning, when Mark still had not come back to the hotel room, they file a missing person report. 3 weeks later, a drug smuggler drove through a police checkpoint without stopping just outside of Matamoros. And so the police pursued him, and this guy ultimately stopped at this secluded ranch up in the mountains. They noticed a ranch worker was standing nearby. They showed him a picture of Mark. He said to police, "Yeah, I have seen him here. The smuggler and his friends, they brought him here, pointed up the mountain towards the shack. That's where they took him." And then when they got right up in front of the shack, what they saw was so gruesome and horrible. 3 weeks earlier, while Bill was urinating in that alleyway, Mark spoke to that girl he wanted to see, and then she went off. And while he was waiting, two men jumped out from behind a building and tried to grab Mark and put him inside of this red truck. Mark was a very fit, big, athletic guy, and so he was able to fight the two men off, but he only made it about 2 blocks when another car full of gangsters showed up, and then at point got him to come into the second vehicle. They drove him up into the mountains to this secluded ranch. This gang that had abducted Mark was more like a cult, and this cult was led by a man named Constanzo, who practiced a form of black magic called Palo. These rituals, which took place in the shack, involved human sacrifice. Constanzo would tell his followers that these people who were going to be sacrificed, they needed to die screaming. The more agony he inflicted on his victims, the more power the gods would grant to he and his followers. After Mark was led out of the vehicle, he was walked up to that shack where he spent several horrifying hours with Constanzo and his cronies, and then at some point Mark was killed when a machete was brought down on the back of his neck. Mark's body was one of 15 discovered in and around this shack. Constanzo had his followers shoot and kill him before the police could get to him. 5 other cult members were ultimately convicted for their roles in the cult's murders, and they were each given a sentence of over 60 years in prison.
This is why you should always be afraid of Australia. In 2014, an 8-year-old and her family went on an extended vacation to, you guessed it, Australia. After a couple of days, she started having this horrible recurring nightmare where an alien would appear in her room and try to grab her with its tentacle. After a week of this, she is terrified to go to sleep, but her parents keep telling her that it's just her overactive imagination. One night, she swears she feels that thing grab her leg and she leaps from the bed screaming. Her family runs into the room and they see her hysterical in the corner, and then they look at the bed and they all gasp. It wasn't an alien. It was a 7-foot-long adult carpet python that had been sneaking in through the ceiling tile and into her bed to stay warm every night.
In 2019, 21-year-old Samantha Josephson was a senior at the University of South Carolina. She was a brilliant student who aspired to be a lawyer. She wanted to practice international law. She needed to be able to speak other languages besides English. And so during her college years, she had really leaned into Spanish. One of her professors was a woman named Daniela Jimenez. Daniela offered to Samantha to kind of be there for her if she needed anything beyond just Spanish. That she was there to help her with law school applications, or she needed advice on something. And by 2019, in Samantha's senior year, the pair had become very close. On March 29th, Samantha decided to go out with her friends for some drinks. So she, along with her friends, head out to this downtown area called 5 Points, which is right near the University of South Carolina. And then around 2 a.m., the group found themselves in a bar called Bird Dog, and a group of friends had separated. Samantha decided that she was just too tired and didn't really feel like staying out any longer, and so she texted her friends and let them know that she was going to head back to her room. She hops in an Uber and she starts driving back towards her campus. Several hours later, they realized Samantha was not in the room. They called the police and reported her missing. At the same time that Samantha was reported missing, there were these 2 men who were in their mid-20s that were located 70 miles to the east of the University of South Carolina. They were out in this forest and they were hunting for turkeys. These 2 men, whose names were Anders and Ryan, they had no luck actually finding these birds. Around 4:30 p.m., Anders, he finally is just ready to admit defeat and leave empty-handed. Something catches his eye off to the left behind some trees, and when he got a full look at this thing, he yelled for Ryan. As Ryan is running into the forest, Anders is pulling his phone out and calling the police. And then the police officers walk into the forest, and before long, they're looking down at Samantha. 14 hours before, Samantha left the Bird Dog Bar and walked out front, and she hailed an Uber. Except that was not an Uber car. That was a car driven by a 24-year-old named Nathaniel Rowland. He was a guy who had been driving around 5 Points all night to try to trick people into getting into his vehicle, believing it was an Uber. She couldn't get out again because the doors were child locked. Nathaniel drove Samantha to some isolated area, most likely 70 miles to the east, near that forested area where her body was found. And then once he parked, Nathaniel pulled out a knife and then leapt into the backseat of his car, and he stabbed her 120 times. It would take Samantha over 10 minutes to finally die. Nathaniel was arrested within 24 hours of the discovery of Samantha's body. While he never offered any motive for the crime, it's believed he simply decided that night he was going to go kill someone. Nathaniel was ultimately convicted of her murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Here are the final images of Samantha as she climbs into Nathaniel's car.
A 17-year-old girl was watching TV late at night when her motion detector lights in her driveway suddenly went on. She assumed it was just an animal, so she got up, drew the blinds, and went back to watching TV. Then a little bit later, it happened again. Before she could even react, she looks over and clearly makes out a silhouette of a person right behind the blinds who starts banging aggressively on the window. The girl stands up and goes, "I'm gonna call the cops!" And the figure stops for just a second, sprints to the side door and starts pounding even louder on that, screaming incoherently. The girl runs to the bathroom, barricades herself inside while she waits for the police, and then her worst nightmares come true. She hears glass shatter in the other room. After a few minutes of silence, she opens her door just a crack to get a peek outside, and standing in her living room next to a broken window is some crazy old woman who looks over at her and starts sprinting toward her. The lady comes smashing into the door and starts wailing on it until the police arrive and take her away. She was a lunatic who had escaped her facility.
A very popular Russian Instagram influencer named Ekterina Didenko was getting ready to celebrate her 29th birthday. She, along with her husband and some of her influencer friends, were planning to enjoy the occasion at a popular spa in Moscow, Russia. The group rented out a private section of the spa that included a steam room and a small indoor pool. When the day finally came, February 28th, which was Didenko's birthday, Didenko, her husband, and the 8 other people they invited go inside, and it's great. Everyone's taking pictures and filming, and then at some point, Didenko's husband signals the rest of the group, and they all begin to pull out these white hazardous materials suits. And they give one to Didenko, and they tell her this is part of her big surprise. She puts on her hazmat suit, and once everyone has their suits on, Didenko's husband wheeled in this huge cooler, and he placed it right on the edge of the pool. It was roughly 55 pounds of dry ice. Because of the huge white gas clouds that come off of dry ice, it's also very commonly used as a spooky decoration. And in fact, that's what Didenko's husband planned to use this dry ice for. He was going to dump it into the pool and create those big white gas clouds all over the pool. Dry ice is considered to be quite hazardous, and while these partygoers all had their hazmat suits on, it's unlikely they were actually wearing them for safety. And so after the dry ice was revealed inside of this cooler, Didenko's husband and another of the partygoers grabbed the sides of the cooler and they dumped its contents directly into the water. And as soon as the dry ice hit the water, it rapidly began to warm up, which caused a massive explosion of carbon dioxide gas to completely fill the lower half of the room. Didenko's husband actually leaps through the cloud into the water and kind of disappears below. And then shortly after that, 2 other partygoers would also leap into the pool. One of the main reasons dry ice is considered to be so hazardous is because dry ice emits that carbon dioxide gas, which at high concentrations will displace oxygen. And so this indoor pool was a small confined space with poor ventilation. And so the 7 people on the pool deck, shortly after this dry ice has been tossed into the pool, pool, they started to realize it was really hard to breathe because the oxygen was basically being sucked out of the room. And so they were able to turn and actually run out of the pool deck before it was too late. Meanwhile, Didenko's husband and the other two people who leapt into the pool, when they came back to the surface, they breathed in an entire lungful of carbon dioxide, which caused two of them to immediately pass out and then just die, while Didenko's husband, he managed to stay conscious enough that he was able to climb barely out of the pool, and he tried to get to the door, but he couldn't get out in time. Eventually, he was pulled out and rushed to the hospital, but he would later die. In May of 2011, 27-year-old Michalina Lewandowska was surprised when she got a text message from her on-again, off-again boyfriend, 27-year-old Marcin Kasperzak. The pair had actually previously been engaged and had a 3-year-old son together, but they just could never seem to make it work for longer than a couple of months at a time. Marcin was asking Michalina if he could take her shopping, something he knew she liked to do. Their son was already being looked after by her mother, and so she said yes. So Michalina took a shower and got ready, and even put on her engagement ring that Marcin had given her. A little while later, Marcin, who was an aspiring bodybuilder, showed up at her Huddersfield, England home. And then as soon as the door shut behind him, he tased Michalina, he jumped on top of her, and then he bound and gagged her. Marcin opened the front door and waved down to his car that was parked on the curb, and one of his friends, this 18-year-old named Patrick, came out, and then Patrick and Marcin worked together to cram Michalina into this small, rugged cardboard box, closed it up, taped it shut, and put it into Marcin's trunk, and drove off. Once they reached the outskirts of town, they parked in a parking lot right next to this huge forest. And from there, they took the box with Michalina inside of it and 2 shovels and walked into the woods, and then using their shovels, they dug a grave. Once it was deep enough, they put Michalina in her box inside of the grave, and then they covered her back up with dirt and then put a 90-pound log on top of her. In the box, Michalina was not dead yet, but she knew if she attempted to escape with Marcin and Patrick right above her, they would just kill her on the spot. And so after waiting an agonizingly long amount of time, Michalina jumped into action. She immediately tried to wriggle her way out of her restraints, but the position they had forced her into, which was basically the fetal position with her hands tied behind her back, it didn't allow her to move very much in any one direction. And so as she's struggling, trying to figure out what she's going to do, she realizes she had chosen to wear her engagement ring that Marcin had given her. And so she began working that ring until finally she did cut through her restraints and her hands were free. And so she managed to force both of her arms right in front of her body. And then once they were in front of her, she immediately began scratching and clawing at the cardboard right above her. And eventually she scratched a hole in the box itself, and dirt began pouring in on her. And she was already very low on oxygen. She was fighting off unconsciousness by remembering that her 3-year-old son needed her, and she had no idea what Marcin was going to do to him. And so she just kept on digging and fighting, pokes all the way through, and she can see sunlight and fresh air comes into the hole. She can breathe again. She forces herself and manages to push all the way up through this hole until she's standing in her grave. And she runs towards the road where she flags down a motorist, and the motorist would call police and then wait with her until they arrived. After Marcin was arrested, the story came out that he had heard a rumor that Michalina was going to be leaving him and going back to Poland with their son, so he had decided he was going to kill her. Marcin was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison, and Patrick was found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. 2008, a 50-year-old man named Carlo was at his home in Connecticut reviewing all this financial documentation. Carlo had filed for bankruptcy a few years earlier, and it had proven to be very complicated. Carlo was an actor, and in many ways he had had lots of success. He had been on Broadway, he had starred in shows and movies, he was a respected actor with lots of contacts in the industry. Despite that, he hadn't really ever made it. It really wasn't translating to financial success. He was married with 4 children to take care of. And on top of that, Carlo also felt this really intense pressure to keep up with his appearances. He had no money, and he felt like he didn't even know how he was going to dig himself out again. He started to have this very dark thought. He began to think, maybe if I were to die, there could be a large insurance payout to my family. That would solve their financial problems, and it would also scond me from looking like the fraud that I really am. He actually went to his wife asking her about their various insurance plans, and eventually he got his wife to tell him, "You have a very generous life insurance policy." When Carlo began researching this route, he quickly learned payouts after on these life insurance plans are very complicated because insurance companies do not want people taking their own life in order to get these payouts. And so Carlo's thinking, I can't take my own life. I'll start picking up really dangerous hobbies. And he's like, oh, I could hire a hitman. The more he thought about it, the more that too seemed highly suspicious. So several months go by and Carlo is still alive. And so Carlo was doing really the only thing he knew he could do, which is just to get out there and audition for various acting opportunities as he possibly could. In late 2008, Carlo got an interesting call from his agent. Carlo's agent quickly explained this role didn't really pay much, but you'd be able to be a part of a very big show, and maybe it lends itself to you getting other work. He received the script, and he quickly realized that this role actually might be more perfect for me than even the producers and directors might realize. This role was for this particular character on the show who sort of hides in plain sight. They're this huge influential character in one way. To the eye of the audience, they sort of look like a nobody. And Carlo very much felt like he was sort of hiding in plain sight. He takes this role, and Carlo does such a world-class job that the director and all these people, they're like, oh my goodness, Carlo is incredible. We gotta find a way to expand this character. Quickly began writing in additional scenes into this big-time show for Carlo's character because Carlo was so good at portraying that character. And as this character's role grew in the show, the audience was like, wow, we love that character. The character became a staple, and it ultimately completely changed Carlo's life. Carlo would get paid millions and millions of dollars and would be nominated for multiple Emmy Awards. You might know Carlo by his full name, which was Giancarlo Esposito. But if that name doesn't ring a bell, you very likely do know him from the role that he portrayed on the show. He was Gus Fring, the chicken shop kingpin from Breaking Bad. Steven Weber was a larger-than-life 38-year-old DJ living in Louisiana. In 2017, through a mutual friend, he met Kenesha Antoine, who was a 38-year-old lawyer also living in Louisiana. And as soon as they met, they immediately hit it off and began dating. In 2019, when Kenesha was going to turn 40, they decided they needed to go somewhere really special to celebrate. And they ultimately settled on going to East Africa because there was a resort there. It was called the Pemba Resort, and it was famous for their underwater room. They literally have a two-story cabin floating 300 meters off the coast. Its main floor is at surface level, and you can take the stairs up to the roof of the main floor where there's another couch and you can stargaze and look out 360 degrees, and there's no other cabins out on the water. You're completely isolated. And then if you go back down to the main floor, there is a ladder that goes straight down 10 meters into the master bedroom, and it's completely underwater. So in September of that year, they got to the Pemba Resort on the mainland, they checked in, and then they loaded into a boat, and then after the boat left them there, Kenesha got out her phone and began filming. And then at some point, they make their way down that ladder down into the master bedroom underwater, and the two just can't stop laughing because it was so bizarre and just so incredible being down there. A little while later, Steven leaves Kenesha in the master bedroom, and he goes upstairs and he puts on fins and then hops in the water. Kenesha, who's still down in the master bedroom, is surprised when she sees her boyfriend on the other side of the glass. And so Kenesha just grabs her phone and starts filming him, and then at some point Steven pulls out a plastic bag with a handwritten note inside of it, and he presses it up against the glass so she can see what it says. And so Kenesha zooms in on the note, and the note says, "I can't hold my breath long enough to tell you everything I love about you, but everything I love about you, I love more and more every day. Will you please be my wife?" And so as she just continues to film him, Steven pulls out a ring and he holds it up to the glass. And now at this point, Kenesha is just beside herself. She couldn't be happier. And so Steven closes the ring box, he grabs the letter, and he swims up out of view back to the surface. And Kenesha turns off the recording, turns around, runs to the ladder, and climbs up to the main floor to give Steven her answer that yes, she would marry him. But when she got up there, she looked around and Steven wasn't up there. And so she runs up onto the roof to get a better look around to see where he went. But when she got up there, she looked down and there's nothing but ocean. There's no sign of Steven anywhere. And so she has no idea what to do. And so she just reflexively begins screaming out for help, hoping that somebody will hear her and come help her find Steven. And after a little while, some boaters hear her yelling out for help. They come over and they begin looking, and they ultimately find Steven. But by the time they found him, it was too late. He had drowned. The details of exactly how he managed to drown or exactly where he was when they found him are not listed online. Here are the final photos of Steven Weber.